Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. Sort of simultaneous to this, I am going to be posting a video recording of me reading the poem by John Keats titled The Eve of St. Agnes. When I started this channel 4 years ago, its primary purpose was to read versions of poems. And I did a number of poems by John Keats. I have a John Keats playlist I will link in the description. One poem that I was never able to manage was The Eve of St. Agnes because I calculated that it would be about a 30-minute recording. And the equipment I was using at the time was my old LG phone, which could accommodate about 30 minutes of recording time, but that was it. And I knew that I would have to go longer because I would have some false starts and have to redo parts. I'm not really handy at editing, so what I was doing with the poems was trying to get it all in one take. And if I needed to, I would just go back and omit where I flubbed up and restart when necessary. So I've been thinking about John Keats recently, and it occurred to me that now that I am working off of better equipment, nothing sophisticated, mind you, that it would be a good time for me to do that poem by Keats. So I have recorded it adequately. I can't say that it's a bang-up job. I'm not a professional at this by any means, and I had to edit out a good number of flub-ups, as I say, including one where I mistakenly said suddenly instead of sudden. Now, I know I could have left that in. I'm sure there are other errors which I did not catch, but I tried to cut off the "ly." So editing something out mid-word on basically YouTube's software is not an easy thing. But I will link that video also in the description and invite you to go and listen to it if it comes out. As I say, adequately. Perfection is not a hallmark of my channel nor indeed of my life. So that poem has been on my mind, and let me tell you why. A booktuber was posting about Lord Byron, and in particular, talking about his book-sized poem, Childe Harold, which is a poem comprising mainly Spencerian stanzas. There's a little bit of otherwise in that epic, but the poem is not, it was a huge sensation for Byron, but it was not, and I don't think it has, there is a Norton critical edition of it, but I don't think it has achieved in posterity the kind of reputation that his Don Juan did. So this booktuber was talking about Byron. And so I am being an old man now. I fell into a bit of the old man's vice of needless pomposity, I guess you could say. And I had to be didactic in my own mind, of course. When you possess a thimble full of knowledge, you want to broadcast it. It's a failing, I will admit. So I wrote, better to have written 42 Spencerians by Keats than the whole of Childe Harold. As the great poet wrote about Byron, quote, "He describes what he sees, I describe what I imagine. Mine is the hardest task." Laughing emoji. The laughing emoji was mine, not Keats. The quote is a little bit longer than that, but that was the salient part that I wanted to get across. Of course, when I say 42 Spencerian stanzas, I am referring to the poem The Eve of St. Agnes, which is a poem in Spencerians of that duration. The booktuber replied, "The harder task may be, but certainly the less enjoyable." To which I rejoined, "Ha, I suppose so." And so, of course, I've had to think about it. Of course, that noise was the cat having what the vet calls a reverse sneeze. She has some sort of allergy, and I don't know what makes it reverse. I don't know how much I trust that particular vet either, but we won't go into that story. A vet that was seen one time. Now, where were we? Oh, we were talking about John Keats. So, the Spencerian stanza, for those who do not know, it's a complicated piece invented by the poet Spencer. And he liked to use interlocking quatrains. So he has a particular type of sonnet, which is A, B, and then the second quatrain will start with that rhyme. And so it's a B, C, B, C. And then the third one will take up with the C, so it'll be C, D, C, D. So the whole first 12 lines would be A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D. And then for him the final couplet is not tied in with the rest. He used the same tied quatrains to invent a stanza form which now carries his name, the Spencerian. So it is two interlocked quatrains of iambic pentameter. So A, B, B, C, B, C, topped off with an Alexandrine, I think is what they call it. It's a line not of 10 syllables, but of 12. And so he wrote his great epic, The Fairy Queen, in that stanza. It's a huge work. I've never been able to read the entirety of it, but parts of it are quite lovely. I am told the entire thing is quite lovely if you can manage it. I couldn't. And I think sometime around the time of Keats, that stanza was in vogue a little bit. I don't know if Byron was the catalyst for that. He may well have been with his Childe Harold. And it's okay. And other famous poems in that form are the one by Keats, The Eve of St. Agnes, and then there's one by Shelley. I don't remember the title, Weep for Adonais, He is Dead, something like that, upon the death of John Keats. So he used the Spencerian stanza as a means to honoring John Keats. It has been my view that aside from Spencer, the only poet who has successfully utilized that particular stanza form was John Keats in that poem. Actually, since then, I have had to walk that back. There is, in fact, I'll try to link this. There is a magnificent poem, a translation from Rumi, but translation, titled The Parrot of Baghdad. And those Spencerians are flawless. But it's not a form that a lot of people have been able to pull off successfully. Somebody else, and I don't know if it was an early thing of Blake or somebody else who did 3 stanzas in that form just as sort of practice. But as I say, nobody has managed it other than Keats. And I've talked about Keats a little bit in previous videos, and I will be referring to the video, My Poetic Journey. Now, I have not gone back to rewatch these things. It's not that important to me. But I will try to take a little bit of a continuation from that. So, Keats's criticism of Byron, that Byron describes what he sees, whereas Keats describes what he imagines, is entirely accurate, I believe. Byron's poetry is remarkable for his perceived wit. So there are a lot of famous rhymes that come out of his poetry, pukes in and ukes in, and hen pecked you all, and I don't know what the other one there was, ineffectual or intellectual, but hen pecked you all. And there's scattershot throughout his epic. There are rhymes like that, done sort of for a laugh. But Byron's poetry is more simply prose restructured into formal poetry, employing all of the forms of prosody quite well. Keats is of a different order entirely. And so when one says that Keats is less enjoyable to read than Byron, it boils down to a matter of what you are looking for when you read poetry. And so the easy comparison is, say, between a can of Coca-Cola and a glass of wine. So wine is a cultured product, and to drink it, if you just drink it cold your first time, you are apt not to like it. Coca-Cola, on the other hand, your first shot of it, you may well be dazzled by the sugar rush and the fizzing. So they're very different experiences. And it's not to say Coke may be a bad analogy simply because of the sugar aspect. We know how bad sugar is for us now. So lessen that aspect of the analogy a little bit, and I think you have the difference. Poetry is not an art that one can take to in a day, or let me rephrase that, because poetry one certainly can. In my experience, I did, but poetry of the highest order, no. So if we go back to Shakespeare's time, Shakespeare, the only poet we have in English that can be said, I think, to equal Keats at his heights, each man at his height. If you take a sonnet by Shakespeare with its sort of complex, parsed out thought, and contrast it with that famous lyric, a contemporary pretty much of his, Gather Ye Rosebuds While Ye May, which is a lovely poem, a magnificent bit of perfection, but is not as intricately thought out as Shakespeare's poem, any one of his sonnets. And I say this when I talk about thought, that of course leads into its own minefield. From the standpoint of the poet, there's no difference to me between Shakespeare and between the other one. Was that Robert Herrick, Gather Ye Rosebuds While Ye May? I can't remember now. Poetry has not really been something that I go back to. And perhaps I will mention a little bit more about that. So the difference between Keats and Byron is of that order. Byron is all well and good if that's what you're looking for. But if you want something that goes a little bit more deeply, you will find that in Keats. And it is not a taste that you necessarily will accommodate yourself to of a tasting, okay? So I talked in my video about how my earliest poets, there were 4 poets that were the be-all and end-all for me as an early writer of poetry. There was Robert Service. There was E.E. Cummings. There was Emily Dickinson, and there was William Blake's. It was not this book exactly, though this was an early book, but when I talk about my first 4 poets and am talking about those 4, I am not describing their complete works. So Blake has a lot of other stuff. He has his prophetic works, and those were not something I touched until later. So these are my 4 first poets. Is that the right way? Yeah. But it was not really that long before I branched from that. And the next man in line was John Keats. And Keats means everything to me that Blake does. I think you could say that to me they are twins of my passion. But these 3 books, as I progressed in the art, became very important to me. So after Blake, these are the editions that I had, but I had them in mass market paperbacks. The Blake, there are also his notebook poems. So it was Songs of Innocence and of Experience, and then his notebook poems, which have a lot of these shorter pieces, which I think his fame mainly rests upon today, regardless. But it was not that long afterwards that I got a book of Keats. This book, in fact, is this the one edited by John Barnard? So I assume they haven't changed these. Marvelous editions, all 3 of these. And then sometime thereafter, it was John Donne. And I don't believe there are comparable books for other poets in the Penguin catalog. There was a selected poems and letters by Gerard Manley Hopkins, which I could class with these, but there's not much like these. And when you are approaching a figure like Keats, you have to understand that you cannot take the whole oeuvre, the whole body of work as of a piece, as of an equivalency in total. Keats particularly died very young, and so there's a handful of poems. I always just say 10. I have not counted them. And they are, I hope that wasn't a gang symbol, excuse me. People are always talking about the YouTube algorithm. I don't want to do anything that gets that mad at me. So, as an addition, if you are a reader and wanting to start reading Keats, you probably don't need something like this because you will be distracted by a lot of extraneous stuff. I've talked a little bit about my initial experience with Keats, and I think probably the very first things that I read by him that made me love Keats was the ballad, I guess you would say, of La Belle Dame sans Merci. I forget how it's, oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering, and so forth. And then a couple of the sonnets which are in every anthology. So the one, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, and Bright Star. Those are all pretty accessible poems. And other things by Keats, even in the anthologies, are less accessible to the novice. So sometime after that, Keats has other sonnets, and so if you have this book and you read through all of his sonnets, then I would say linger on whatever sonnet appeals to you and just become familiar with it, get to know that sonnet. Because the sonnets early on that meant a lot to me were not necessarily the anthologized ones. And I think you will know what those are if you go and listen to my John Keats playlist. Sometime after, I got into the odes, and of course the Ode on a Grecian Urn was the first. It's the shorter of the two greatest, the other being Ode to a Nightingale. And it took some work, and I got to it. I familiarized myself with it. The thing with poetry, anecdote time, I used to work for a small opera company, and our soprano would sometimes come, we would sometimes meet in the home of my voice teacher, my opera teacher who ran the company. And our soprano would sometimes say, well, if somebody asks, how's the aria going that she was having to learn for the upcoming opera? Well, I broke the back of that aria. Singers will do that in different ways, and they'll talk about it in different ways when you're learning a piece of music like that. Some people have said, well, you should start at the last. So start at the last 2 bars or 4 bars, and then gradually add, so that by the time you have the whole thing, you're most secure at the climax of the piece anyhow, or the finish of the piece. But the phrase breaking the back, it always kind of made me cringe a little bit because it's such a violent term. But expresses adequately the involvement and work that the soprano had to put in before she could just reel off the song as though it were, a nightingale warbling or whatever. Woodlark, that's what I... Oh, say, sweet warbling woodlark, stay, nor quit for me the trembling spray. A hapless lover courts thy lay, thy soothing fond complaining. Again, again, that tender part, that I might catch thy melting art. Surely that would touch her heart, that kills me with disdaining, or something like that. So let me say the woodlark instead of the nightingale. So the thing with poetry is that you, as the reader, have to do the equivalent work of the soprano in the analogous instance. You cannot just pick it up and read it and expect to understand it. Even as if you drink a glass of wine, you can't just automatically know what's there. Now, I don't have a sophisticated palate, okay? But I knew a guy who did. And if you see, I think usually we see pastiches of people talking about wine. Well, he could drink a glass of something blindly and tell you about it. He could tell you where the grape was raised in France and what kind of barrel it had been in and so forth. And I, of course, could never do something like that, and most of us can't. And so there's a lot of pretension that goes along with wine drinking, and there's an awful lot of pretension, potentially, with literature, and with particularly the teaching of literature, if that's your avenue for imbibing it, okay? But that's neither here nor there, I suppose. So I've given the anecdote before, but when I decided to break, using the Sopranos metaphor here, the Eve of St. Agnes, the first time that I read it, I got 21 stanzas through, and I fell back exhausted. It had just utterly destroyed me. And then the next day, I got up and did it again. And I read the first 21 and then the second 21. And that time, I fell back exhausted again. But with time and with repetition, it became easier. And so once you have it, in a sense, you don't just automatically forget it. Just like you may sing, well, I just did, a song that you heard 50 years ago, and you still retain it somewhat. There was a time when I said to myself, I could probably reproduce all of Keats's great poems if every manuscript in the world was lost, because they're just in here. They were not in here that well, but some of the cadences and a lot of the lines, of course, are irrevocable. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, and so forth, to cease upon the midnight with no pain. Prepositions and so forth, of course, would get mixed up. But so you retain that sort of stuff. The thing is, if you're approach to poetry is simply a linear approach. So you're reading poetry as though it were prose, then you may indeed find the work of Keats an arduous task. Not a pleasant reading experience at all. And so if you are approaching poetry in that fashion, then a certain poet such as Byron might appeal to you more. I can vouch, though, that if you stay in the game a long time, that the more sophisticated poetry of Keats will last longer. It will tide you better than Byron. I would argue that an investment in 10 poems by Keats are worth the entire oeuvre of Byron. But that is my pomposity and my little thimble of knowledge that I feel like spreading. Well, a video such as this is, I guess, an okay place to do that. And people are certainly welcome and invited to rebut that in the comments if they like, or in another video. But when I say there are 10 poems by Keats, and I say that you probably don't need this edition, until later, I mean, after you've gotten the taste for Keats, I mean, he's similar to Wilfred Owen in that, well, I never understood how a person of his age could produce poetry at such a level of mastery. And I'm not really talking about technique here or technical stuff, prosody. I'm talking about the deep substance. It's unfathomable to me, but I think joining his name with Wilfred Owen does explain a little bit. He had that one terrible year, even as you might say Wilfred Owen did. And I would say in both poets' cases, the extenuating circumstances of their lives caused them to ripen. I don't want to use the word prematurely, but caused them to ripen when they did. Whereas under easier circumstances, I think the ripening would not have happened so swiftly and so acutely. So there is a nice book. You might hear sometimes that year referred to of Keats as the living year. Let me see if I can give you a title page. This is by Robert Gittings. It's a very, very nice book. And he also did a regular biography. Let's see if I have it here. Yeah, here it is. They're both good books, but this is a shorter treatment, really touching upon what happened in that year. Others might have things to add to that since. When I love a poet, then I may well investigate their biography. And I'll just show you another one that I have here. So, and with Keats, I think that the biographical information only adds to the poignancy of the poetry. Of course, with Keats, you want to read his letters too. This is a selection by Giddings. So as you can see, I liked Robert Giddings. I'm not excessive. I don't feel that I need to read every biography of a certain figure. So I've read biographies of Keats. I've read them of Owen and of Eliot and of Mackay, but not too many others, because generally speaking, you don't need any biographical information to appreciate a poem, or you shouldn't. And then because I have it, I thought I would show you this one, the Keats Inheritance by Robert Giddings, which I don't even know why or how I have this, but let me read you the author's note. During the opening stages of work on a new biography of John Keats, based far more closely than usual on original documentary sources, I became aware that there was one considerable area which had been neither explained nor fully explored in previous biographies. This was the problem of Keats's poverty, how a young man who had been well provided for in two wills, his grandfather's and his grandmother's, should find himself literally penniless before he was 25 and die at that age in debt to friends and to publishers. The special importance that this lack of money assumed in his great creative year made the problem not merely academic, but intimately connected with his poetry. I really only had the idea gel of the early ripening when I read that paragraph recently. I haven't read the book about the inheritance, but it's good to know that it exists and that Robert Giddings delved into the subject so deeply. So for Keats, the Dover Thrift Edition is a good starting point if you want, if you want the great stuff. There might be a great sonnet missed here or there, and there is poetry that's included that may not strike your fancy either. So I think the Pot of Basil, that might have been an early attempt at the Spencerian stanza. I don't really recollect. And then there's Lamia, I bet, is in there too, which is a poem in couplets. And I think Giddings considers Lamia as of equal stature to any of his other great poems. It's never struck me that way. It's never been a favorite poem of mine. Maybe I should go back to it, revisit it. I mentioned that I don't read poetry, and this is indeed the truth. When I wrote my first book of sonnets, one of the poems in there has a line to the effect that I never read poetry. The conceit of the poem was having known this love, or this love object that is the focal point of that particular sonnet, that I have not needed poetry. And that is the essential fact of the matter too. But to say that I never read poetry is an exaggeration, and I have here and there read poetry for usually particular reasons, never for simply occasions of pleasure. So it's not something for me to sit back of an evening and whip out songs of innocence and of experience and just read that for pleasure. It would not be done. But if I'm thinking about something and I need to cross-reference something, In some cases, I was writing a prose piece. Well, in those instances, I would return to these poems. So that would mark a return, or just something pops into my head, a question, and I need to refer to it. Then I will do so. I have a video where somebody, I was responding to someone who was denigrating E. Cummings. And so that prompted me to look a little bit further at his poetry. So those are occasions. If I'm not a scholar per se, I have no academic support behind any of the reading of poetry that I have done. So I have not caught everything. And so if I discover a poet of whom I had not known, then I will get a book of poetry by that poet and read it. So I will read poetry under those circumstances. And then further, when I started this channel, and I started with mainly sort of canonical works or works that were familiar to me from 40 years past, or 30 years past, let's say. And I don't need to exaggerate that. That book of sonnets was written, I think, slightly less than 30 years ago. And I was reading poetry pretty much up until around that time. But as I ran out of things to make videos of, I was using the channel as a means to distract myself from the presidential campaign going on between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, the first one. And as I began to exhaust that primary material, then I purposely, or purposively, if that's a word, I don't know, purposefully, I like purposively best, but I don't think that's a real word, is it? With intention, sought out other anthologies, such as the Everyman's Library, where they will have an anthology devoted to poems about horses. And I sought those out, and I knew that in those I could find the extraneous poems here or there that did not make it to the Norton anthology or whatever anthology I used. And I think primarily I stuck with the Norton, but I would have other more specific anthologies, American poetry, metaphysical poetry, and so forth, but never so specific as horses or railroads. So I did read poetry, and I still do read poetry now. Now a lot of my poetry is reserved for poems in translation. So when I found somewhere a book of translations by the poet Boris Pasternak, whom I had never read, well, I got the book and I read. Not every single poem, but some of them. Or I found an anthology of certain Japanese poems. And in that case, I don't read from A to Z. I don't read from the first page to the last. With that kind of anthology, I just dip in. But when I'm learning something new, a new poet, a new genre, poetry from a language that is unfamiliar to me, then I will do so. And I came, Aaron Facer at his channel brought to my attention an edition of the Rime, I guess is how you would say it, of Dante. And so I immediately ordered it and read his poems. Again, not every single poem, because it was sort of an anthology. And particularly since having left poetry behind, I wrote what I consider to be my last book of poems, a second book of sonnets. I believe I have a video about that. I'll put whatever videos seem relevant into the description if I remember. Considering myself retired at this point, I particularly don't have any need whatsoever to look at poetry or any of the great poems. It's interesting, though, thinking about this has given me thought when it comes to my own poetry that I probably should consider doing some kind of a where to start video of my own books, because I realize now that if you are looking to begin with Keats and you just get this and you go through every poem, every bit of writing from the childish juvenilia to the unfinished epics. One of them may have been finished or it may exist in a couple of revisions. I'm really not sure about the status. They contain beautiful lines, but they are not comprehensive, finished works, and they are not at the level of Keats's living year, the poetry from that living year. So if you attempt to learn the poetry of Keats that way, you may well find yourself giving up the project. I think I said in a previous video that one is better off just becoming familiar, very familiar with 2 or 3 of Shakespeare's sonnets than reading through the whole 152, whatever it is, straight through one time. And so as such with Keats, you should start with the basic, with the simplest, if you will. So La Belle Dame sans Merci, the sonnets, which are only 14 lines apiece, and get to know those first before you even consider going into the odes. And then the odes are all worth looking at, and they're all pretty good. I'm not a particular lover of the Ode to Psyche, but all the others are good. Not to the level necessarily of the 2 perennially anthologized, the Grecian Urn and the Nightingale. But that would be the next step to take. And then possibly after that, you could, when you are thoroughly immersed in those and you feel those poems within yourself, then you can go on and try the Eve of St. Agnes. But if you just jump right in, and as I say, other poems such as the Pot of Basil, you might as well just skip. But if you take it slow, poetry is an art. I know I'm contradicting myself. I've said elsewhere that it's not an art. It is an art that haste can only ruin for you. The corollary to that is that it is a form of literature that is probably best not approached with omission of the subvocalization, which some readers use to speed up their reading. There is no hurry with Keats. And if you read La Belle Dame sans Merci, and that's the only poem you ever read by Keats, but you know that one, then you've done better than reading anything else or reading the whole works of the man. So I've talked on long enough, and I should leave this here. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.